Few, if any, directors have a perfect filmography. Even legends like Spielberg and Scorsese have their misses. For a large portion of Nolan's career, though, he was yet to make a film that was widely regarded as a disappointment. Sure, The Dark Knight Rises isn't looked on fondly anymore, but upon release, it was actually received very positively. This hot streak would seemingly end in 2020, however, with the release of Tenet. Nolan first came up with many of the concepts present within Tenet nearly 20 years earlier, and had been working on the project in the background since 2014. It's a film that's undeniably Nolan, and he clearly approached it with his usual passion and creativity. Despite this, Tenet was almost immediately recognized as his worst movie to date. Many called it confusing and all over the place. Its time-bending and reality-warping narrative failed to resonate with most audiences. And it didn't just fail critically, it also failed to break even at the box office, although that was almost entirely due to it releasing in the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic. Still, this doesn't help its reputation among Nolan's filmography as the director's one major misstep. I was well aware of this reputation before my first viewing of Tenet, and was prepared for the worst. Did Tenet meet my low expectations, or could it perhaps be a misunderstood masterpiece? Today we'll be finding the answers to those questions, and over the past few months, I've taken a look at each film in Christopher Nolan's stellar filmography. If you'd like to see those reviews, I've put a link to the playlist in the description. And the final review, focusing on Christopher Nolan's Oppenheimer, will be releasing in the following weeks. If that sounds interesting to you, feel free to subscribe. Now without further ado, let's get into Nolan's most contentious project yet, Tenet. As I mentioned, Nolan came up with many of the concepts present in Tenet over the course of 20 years, but it was only in 2014 that he officially began working on the script. One inspiration that clearly came early on was the Sador Square. In case you're unfamiliar, the Sador Square is a word square containing Latin palindromes, words spelled the same both forward and backward. Although being the subject of extensive research, the meaning and origin of the square remains a mystery. Either way, Nolan was clearly fascinated by it, with each word featured on the square being present in Tenet. In fact, it's the film's namesake. The other words in the square being Sador, represented through the surname of the primary antagonist, Arepo being the name of the Spanish art forger, Opera is alluded to through the opening sequence taking place at an opera house, and finally, Rotus is the name of the security company running the Oslo Freeport. Interestingly enough though, despite the many overt references to the square, it's never once mentioned. Still, the palindromes serve a clever purpose, as they represent both standard entropy and inversion, with these concepts making up the very core of Tenet. While the whole idea of reversing an object or person's entropy is somewhat rooted in science, unlike Interstellar, Nolan wasn't going for scientific accuracy with Tenet. Kip Thorne allegedly was consulted on a few occasions, but he had very little involvement overall, and asked not to have his name attached to Tenet, since he felt it might imply the story is meant to be scientifically accurate, which evidently is not the case. Tenet also took heavy inspiration from spy movies, of which Nolan is a huge fan. In fact, on multiple occasions he's expressed his love for the James Bond franchise in particular. Not wanting to be inspired to the point of being derivative, however, Nolan refrained from watching any spy movies for inspiration. And to the end of being unique, I would say Tenet succeeds. It's definitely a wholly original narrative, unlike anything I've ever seen before. And part of what makes Tenet distinct is the unique environment and atmosphere. Longtime collaborator with Nolan, Nathan Crowley, returned once again as production designer for Tenet, and as always, his contributions cannot be overstated. Despite much of Tenet being shot on location rather than on a soundstage, it still manages to have a cohesive look. While Tenet's narrative is definitely larger than life, its visuals remain grounded in reality. This also applies to elements unique to Tenet, like the turnstiles and algorithm. These complex pieces of tech, appearing at first to be ordinary, is an aesthetic choice that lends itself to the narrative, in which nothing is ever what it seems. Another key element of Tenet's distinct visual style is the cinematography. Hoyt van Hoytema returned from Dunkirk, fresh off an Academy Award nomination. And while Tenet wouldn't even be nominated for Best Cinematography, his work here is fantastic yet again. The use of IMAX in Tenet, while inferior to Dunkirk, is still incredibly impressive. Aside from just being visually distinct, Tenet is also just a beautiful film. The colors really pop during certain sequences, and the use of blue and red to denote the flow of entropy creates some interesting visuals. Another aspect of the visuals that has to be mentioned when discussing any Nolan project are the impressive practical effects. Tenet features many of the spectacular sequences that have become typical of Nolan, like the highway chase and final battle, but Tenet goes even further than that. There's a few inverted scenes which are very technically impressive, and the fight choreography in these is phenomenal. The real star of the show in terms of practical effects, though, has to be the plane crash. To accomplish this shot, instead of using miniatures or VFX, they actually just purchased a 747 and crashed it. Most of what you're seeing in this sequence is exactly what happened. While each Nolan project seems to get more and more impressive with its use of practical effects, Nolan may have raised the bar to insurmountable heights with this one. Despite both Nathan Crowley and Hoytman Hoytema coming back for Tenet, two Nolan mainstays wouldn't be able to return. Editor Lee Smith was busy with 1917 at the time, and composer Hans Zimmer chose to do Dune instead. In their place are newcomers to Nolan's filmography, editor Jennifer Lame and composer Ludwig Göransson. As for the editing, it's up there in terms of quality with Nolan's previous projects. His unorthodox plot structures strike again with Tenet, and Jennifer Lame was clearly up to the task. While Tenet can be a difficult narrative to follow, I'd withhold any blame on the editing department. I did find the cuts between sequences to be abrupt at times. However, this was likely necessary in order to keep the runtime under control, due to just how dense Tenet's narrative is. And clearly Nolan liked Jennifer Lame's work, as she would return for both Oppenheimer and The Odyssey. Now for Ludwig Göransson, and Tenet's score as a whole. Simply put, this is one of the greatest film scores ever made. I didn't think this would be a hot take, but from the research I've done, while Tenet's soundtrack is often praised, I feel it still doesn't get the respect it deserves. It is intensely unique and experimental, which matches the nature of Tenet as a whole. It also features many tracks that sound the same regardless of whether they're played forward or backward, mirroring the palindromic nature of the narrative. While I do understand why some may not fully appreciate Tenet's score, since it is very unique, for me personally, it's in my top 3 favorite film scores of all time. With post-production complete, the time now came to release Tenet, which unfortunately would prove to be its own ordeal. Surely you don't need me to tell you this, but 2020 was a bad time for the film industry. I mean, it's a bad time for the world really, but we'll focus on the film industry. Tenet was originally slated for a July 17th, 2020 release. A certain pandemic affected this release, however, with Tenet being pushed back to July 31st, then to August 12th. Nolan wanted the movie to release in theaters in spite of world events, and pushed Warner Bros. To do a theatrical release instead of releasing the film on HBO Max. Finally, following these negotiations, Tenet was released in the UK on August 26th, and in the US September 3rd. To the surprise of absolutely no one, the global pandemic seemed to have an effect on Tenet's box office performance, with the project failing to break even. Unfortunately, this reality was unavoidable though. Tenet was meant to serve as a tentpole, propping up Warner Bros. And to an extent the larger film industry in those uncertain times. While the poor box office performance couldn't be helped, Tenet didn't just struggle at the box office. As the reviews and audience reactions came pouring in, one thing became abundantly clear. Most people had no idea how to feel about Tenet. While some, like director Denis Villeneuve, called it a masterpiece and an incredible cinematic achievement, others critiqued its convoluted plot, claiming it was all over the place. While few went as far as to call it a bad film, reviews were mixed to say the least. It currently holds the lowest score in Nolan's filmography on Rotten Tomatoes, with a 70%. As I covered a few weeks ago though, Nolan's second lowest rated film on the site, Interstellar, is now lauded as a masterpiece by many. Could a similar turnaround be in store for Tenet, or is it really just a convoluted mess? While Tenet's opening scene has been criticized for a multitude of reasons, I find that it, along with everything else in this movie, just gets better and better on each rewatch. And one of my favorite parts of this opening occurs before the movie actually begins. The studio logos are stylized to resemble both standard entropy and inversion. The Warner Bros. Logo is red, with the music playing forward, while Syncope's logo is blue, with the same track inverted. On a first viewing, this isn't something a viewer is going to pick up on. And admittedly, it's not that complex of a reference. But the fact that it's hidden and a part of the film people usually pay no mind to is interesting. It reminds me of Alien 3's opening, in which the Fox fanfare is ominously extended, setting the tone of the narrative to come. Similarly, the inversion during the Syncope logo catches the audience off guard, and transitions perfectly into the ominous music accompanying this opening shot. And once the conductor arrives, it's revealed this ominous music is diegetic, and is simply the musicians tuning their instruments. This serves to pull us into this world, and the music quickly being cut off, followed by a sudden terrorist attack, shocks the viewer, ensuring that the following sequence has their full attention, which is pretty much a prerequisite to enjoy Tenet. We're then introduced to our protagonist, as the brilliant track Rainy Night in Talon plays. This track continues throughout the rest of this complex, yet visually interesting action sequence. It's full of energy, and it engrosses the viewer into this scene, despite the fact that we're not quite sure what's happening. As for the action sequence itself, all throughout Tenet, these have seen a noticeable upgrade from Nolan's previous work. Tenet's action is in a similar vein to The Dark Knight Rises and Inception. However, I find these action sequences much easier to follow visually and significantly more interesting. Part of that is due to the unique mechanics of Tenet, but also the level of polish with the stunts is incredible. And it's combined with a different editing style that I personally find more appealing. Gone are the days of quick cuts, preventing the viewer from being able to make out what exactly is happening, and rapidly cutting from the good guys to the bad guys in a firefight. While those choices in Nolan's previous work did have their place, I never was a fan of the way Nolan directed certain action sequences. That's not to say he hasn't done it well. The Dark Knight Rises and Inception both have examples of incredible action sequences. But generally speaking, I found some of Nolan's action either difficult to follow or just plain boring. Tenet's take on action is far more subjective, focusing almost entirely on our protagonist rather than the enemy he's facing. This subjective cinematography could have been a skill Nolan took from his work on Dunkirk, in which the subjective experience of the characters were the crux of that narrative. And I want to say again that this is entirely a matter of preference. I know some people that really enjoyed Batman Begins action sequences and found Inception's third act entertaining all the way through. But for me personally, Tenet's action sequences held my attention far better than any other Nolan project. I'll focus on John David Washington's performance more later, but in terms of just his physical presence, that also plays a role in making the action visually interesting. He moves with an intensity that is unique for this kind of story. Usually spy movies have a suave protagonist who doesn't seem to have to put much effort into his actions. The protagonist of Tenet, on the other hand, seems to be putting his all into every motion. Yet as is seen during the kitchen fight scene, he's able to turn it on and off in an instant. And speaking of that kitchen fight scene, it's probably the best hand-to-hand combat sequence of Nolan's career. Typically, those suave characters I mentioned are one step ahead of everyone else as well. They're excellent at withholding information or lying to achieve their goals. Tenet's protagonist, though he does lie for a majority of the narrative, isn't very good at it. At his core, he's a genuine guy who's concerned about people. We see this as soon as the opening sequence, when he puts himself in harm's way in order to save the civilians in the opera house. And we see it yet again after the opening sequence, when he cries after finding out that his team didn't make it out. And his fighting style reflects this aspect of his personality. He wears his heart on his sleeve, as much as is possible for an intelligence agent. The opening sequence also familiarizes us with other aspects of the protagonist's personality. He's a leader and improvises easily, yet tends to rush into things, putting himself in harm's way, with each of these character details proving to be crucial later on in this story. This opening sequence is an audio-visual spectacle and has a great bit of character building. All that combined with the mystery of the inverted man and ending with the protagonist committing suicide makes this sequence intensely memorable. Why do some take issue with this scene then? Simply put, it's too confusing, especially on a first viewing. The film makes no attempt to explain to the viewer what is happening or why in the moment, and the explanations offered immediately after are subpar as well. What some fail to realize though, is that this is by design. Tenet's narrative is a palindrome. The story begins and ends on the same day. It stands to reason then, that elements of the opening become clearer as we get closer to the ending. This is indicative of a larger issue many have with Tenet, which I'll dive further into later. But for now, I'll just say that it is entirely valid for a viewer to dislike Tenet's narrative structure. As I mentioned earlier though, Tenet just gets better and better on each rewatch, along with this opening scene. And watching the opening of this movie with the full context of the events, and knowledge of what other events are transpiring at the same time, is especially interesting. There's always a new detail to pick out, and I can never get tired of Tenet's opening. For the sake of transparency, I will say now that I absolutely love Tenet, and I'll get further into why momentarily, but for the sake of fairness, it is important to point out some of the narrative's genuine flaws. And the most valid criticisms I hear about Tenet are in regard to the dialogue and exposition. Now, Tenet's poor sound mixing is a topic that has been discussed ad nauseum, but it really is a complex issue. This complaint has plagued Nolan for a large part of his career, but really I only find it to be an issue during select sequences in Interstellar and in Tenet. The Dark Knight Rises also had sound issues with Bane, but generally I could understand what he was saying just fine. His dialogue was just mixed strangely with the rest of the audio. Back to Tenet though, the biggest problem comes down to simply understanding what the characters are saying. And before you say just turn on subtitles, yes, that does solve the issue, but simply put, lots of people just don't enjoy watching movies with subtitles. For me personally, I watch absolutely everything with subtitles. I watch a lot of anime after all, so this isn't a problem for me. But to simply say just use subtitles as an attempt to deflect the criticism doesn't make sense. By that same logic, if a film had poor color grading, would you suggest that I change the settings of my monitor to fix it? Even if it was easy to do so, as a viewer, that shouldn't be my job. Fixing technical issues like this is the job of the professionals who worked on the film in the first place. And I also am aware that Nolan claims this was an intentional choice made for Tenet, which I do respect during certain sequences. I actually agree with him that using audio in a unique way offers interesting storytelling opportunities, and that it isn't always essential for an audience to be able to understand what the characters are saying. To provide an example of where Tenet does this well, take the scene where Neil scopes out the Rotus security system at the Freeport. The audience can only hear bits and pieces of what the employee is saying, as the intense track titled Freeport drowns out his dialogue. This sequence works because what the employee is saying is non-essential. It also highlights how Neil is tuning him out, instead focusing on the details of the security system. This is an interesting, creative choice that actually serves the narrative. The key detail that makes the sequence work, though, is the fact that what the employee is saying is not essential to the plot. There are several instances throughout Tenet, though, where crucial information is given in a way that is difficult to hear or understand. The problem with the dialogue in Tenet isn't usually that it's too quiet or drowned out by music or sound effects. No, the dialogue is usually difficult to understand due to a combination of factors. There's a particularly infamous line delivered at the beginning of the third act by Aaron Taylor Johnson's character, which showcases these issues well.
Well, we better put it out the hole before the bomb goes off, eh?
In this scene, we get major details that help establish what exactly is going on in the third act. This is undoubtedly important information, so why is it so hard to understand? The first reason is that the music actually is a bit too loud here. That's not as common of an issue in Tenet as some make it seem, but it is true in this scene. The second reason is the fact that the characters are wearing masks. This not only muffles their voice, but also makes it impossible to see the actors' lips, despite the masks being clear. And while we may not be aware of it, we all subconsciously read lips to aid in understanding speech. Two more expository scenes with intelligibility issues are the Sir Michael Crosby scene and the F-50 sailboat scene, with the F-50 scene being the moment I have the biggest issue with personally. The information being given in this scene doesn't actually have that much bearing on the plot, but the audience doesn't know that on their first viewing, and the dialogue is just barely audible enough for the audience to feel like they should be able to understand what the characters are saying. Not only is the dialogue muffled, as it seems to be coming through some sort of radio, but the music drowns it out a bit, and the set piece is incredibly distracting. And again, the dialogue doesn't actually matter that much, which on a second viewing makes the entire scene feel unnecessary. So basically, on a first viewing, the scene is confusing. It makes the viewer feel like they're missing out on crucial exposition. And on repeat viewings, it just feels like a waste of time. There really is no reason for the scene to be here, and it just further exacerbates many people's issues with the film. And you might be thinking, no, the scene is necessary because Kat has to try and kill Andre. And while yes, that is partially true, this could have been done in so many other ways. Now, for the other scene I mentioned that people often complain about, the Sir Michael Crosby scene, that actually has an entirely different issue from the other scenes I mentioned. All the issues people have with the audio almost purely come down to audience members not being able to understand Michael Caine's accent, which isn't an entirely valid criticism on its own. However, I usually can understand Michael Caine's accent just fine, but I also had a problem with this scene, and I realized the problem isn't actually the audio, it's the dialogue itself. The exposition is delivered in such a roundabout way that it's almost impossible to keep up, and the sheer amount of information is headache-inducing. Pretty much the entire movie is laid out in this one 3-minute scene, which is simply way too much information to expect the audience to actually process. Now, lots of the exposition provided in this scene is reiterated later in the story, but unfortunately, the aforementioned scene with Ives is where the most crucial piece of information is elaborated on, which obviously had its own issues, as we've discussed. While I do have my issues with the Sir Michael Crosby scene, I love the final line. The protagonist turns and says, "Goodbye, Sir Michael." A seemingly unremarkable moment, until you realize this is the last line ever spoken to Michael Caine in a Christopher Nolan film. He had made 8 straight appearances in Nolan's movies, with Tenet marking his final time working with the director. And while we're on the topic of the cast, we may as well talk about the other actors' performances, starting with John David Washington as our protagonist. As I've alluded to, I actually like his character. I find him unique for this kind of story, and appreciate the nuances John David Washington brought to the character. But this is actually one of the most contentious aspects of Tenet. The protagonist is very basic, and this was clearly intentional, seeing as the protagonist is never actually given a name. John David Washington is even credited as the protagonist. Tenet doesn't really have any complex characters. It's similar to Inception in that way, but at least the movie had DiCaprio's character Cobb, and with him, his character's desire to see his children again. An emotional and understandable motivation. The only character with any real motivation beyond stopping the bad guy and saving the world is Elizabeth Debicki's character, Kat. And while I understand the character criticisms for Tenet, I don't fully agree with them. A complex main character wouldn't have really served this story, and most likely would have distracted from it. There's already a lot going on in Tenet, and a complicated protagonist wouldn't have helped viewers keep up with the plot, which proved to be a problem regardless. I feel that the movie gives us what we need. A simple good guy who wants to save people. We don't know why he wants to save people or how he acquired the skills to do that, but at the end of the day, it doesn't matter. That information has no bearing on the events that transpire in Tenet, which are fascinating enough in their own right. All of this isn't to say that the characters are written poorly in Tenet though, or that there's no depth to them whatsoever. Going back to Elizabeth Debicki's performance as Kat, I found her very interesting. She's the only character who really has a journey throughout the narrative, and for the time she was given, I found her appropriately complex. Another interesting character was Robert Pattinson's Neil. On a first viewing, he does enough to remain relevant, but doesn't stand out in any particular way. He benefits the most from repeat viewings though, not only with the added context provided by the ending, but also when taking into account the fan theories surrounding him. The main theory being he's actually Kat's son Max from the future. An interesting idea that becomes less plausible the more you think about it, but still a fun thought nonetheless. There is one character I believe is appropriately criticized in Tenet though, that being Kenneth Branagh's character, Andrei Sador, the main antagonist. Branagh does a fine job, but he was given so little to work with. Sador is a very generic villain. That being said, he does have a strong presence, and his motivation is slightly more nuanced than I anticipated. Of course, all villains think they're actually the hero, but in Sador's case, he actually could be seen as one from a certain point of view. Sure, he's killing everyone who's ever existed, including his own son, but if you're from the future, you'd likely view him as a hero who's saving the human race. And while not executed perfectly, the protagonist and Sador's dialogue on how each generation fights for its own survival does present some interesting ideas. Though our protagonist is saving the world, he's dooming future generations. Then again, they may have been doomed anyway, as destroying past generations may erase their existence in the first place. So he might actually be saving everyone who's ever lived, past, present, and future. It all hinges on the grandfather paradox the film briefly discusses. Speaking of Tenet's ending though, this was definitely one of my favorite parts of the movie. The editing, music, and cinematography are all great, and at this point the audience is familiar with the mechanics of Tenet, so they can actually enjoy the chaos of this final battle, while being only mildly confused. The best part of the ending though is when the dust finally settles, and we get the reveal that the protagonist founded Tenet in the future, and recruited Neil. Not only that, but from Neil's point of view, they've been close friends for years. This scene does a lot of heavy lifting for this story, as it establishes an emotional core, explains the entire story, and brings everything full circle. That emotional core being the friendship between our protagonist and Neil. And this is especially heartbreaking, as just a few minutes earlier, we saw Neil die for the protagonist, though we didn't know it at the time. This moment also solves the mystery of the inverted man present in the opening. This reveal in the closing moments, explaining something in the opening, being one of the many palindromes present in the narrative. And this scene also dives further into the themes of free will versus determinism. And with Tenet, Nolan takes a similar stance in this discussion as he does in Inception, with the debate of whether objective reality exists. At their core, these debates present the same dilemma, one Nolan is clearly very interested in, as 3 of his films thus far have discussed it. The basic idea being, do our actions matter? In the objective reality debate, the idea is that there is no true right and wrong, and each individual makes their own opinions based on their biases. If there's no true right and wrong, there's no consequences, and thus no reason to act at all. So it presents the question, why do anything? And in the free will debate, the idea again is that our actions potentially have no consequence. So why do anything? Where Memento and even Inception left the answer to that question a bit open-ended, Tenet provides dialogue containing Nolan's answer. Robert Pattinson's character repeatedly says, "What's happened, happened," which seems to express a belief in determinism. However, in his final scene, he adds this is an expression of faith in the mechanics of the world. It's not an excuse to do nothing, which serves as Nolan's answer to the free will debate, with this answer essentially being that it doesn't really matter. Regardless of whether our actions actually have any consequence, it is each individual's responsibility to do good, or at the very least, do something. Although Nolan seems to lean toward believing in free will, as is seen when the mechanics of inversion are explained to the protagonist, where nothing happens unless he makes it happen. While this is an interesting idea, I didn't find myself as engrossed by it as I was with the objective reality debate present in both Memento and Inception, although that's mostly because I'm a firm believer in free will in general, so this whole idea of determinism just isn't as thought-provoking to me personally. Still, the concept is handled well in Tenet. So why is Tenet often considered to be deeply flawed? It mostly comes down to the plot structure. The unorthodox palindromic nature of the plot didn't work for many viewers, for the simple reason that people don't like to be confused. Many audience members think that if they're confused, the story is bad and the writer should have done a better job of explaining things. And 9 times out of 10, they would be correct. In Tenet, though, you're not supposed to know everything until the final act. And even then, it takes multiple viewings to fully understand the scope of Tenet's narrative. Most audience members don't have that trust in the writer that things will eventually make sense, or aren't willing to give up their time or attention to understand the full scope of the plot, which is the decision that they are well within their right to make. While people are always allowed to have their own opinions on which movies they do or don't enjoy, Tenet is one of the most reasonable great films to not enjoy. If you watched Tenet and didn't like it, that makes sense. In the truest sense, it's just not your thing, and that's completely fine. It is mine though, and I absolutely love Tenet. A big reason for that comes down to a habit of mine. I rewatch movies constantly. I rewatch movies so often that I struggle to find time to watch new ones. So in that sense, Tenet was made for me. There's always a new detail to pick up on each rewatch. It is endlessly rewatchable. While lots of films benefit from a rewatch, Tenet is unique in the sense that it requires at least one rewatch to actually be enjoyed. While I always watch a movie several times when making a video on it, I genuinely lost track of how many times I watched Tenet. Even after all these rewatches, I'm still fascinated by what Nolan was attempting here, and what he was able to accomplish. In a way, Tenet reminds me of Stanley Kubrick's 2001: A Space Odyssey. Now I want to clarify, in no way am I comparing the two in terms of quality. Tenet reminds me of 2001 in terms of what it was attempting to do and what it requires from the viewer. Back in 1968, cinema didn't have as firm of a definition as it does today. The limits of what a film could be weren't even close to being tested, and 2001 pushed those boundaries. Even today, despite its influence, it exists outside of what is typical from a feature film. I would even go so far as to say that 2001 couldn't be released today, or at least wouldn't be nearly as popular. Not that it wouldn't hold up in terms of quality, because it shockingly would, but rather that cinema has largely been homogenized as entertainment first. Since audiences in 1968 didn't have as firm of a definition in their minds of what a film should or shouldn't be, they were open to a more unique experience like 2001. Obviously 2001 did have its critics even back then, but it was received mostly positively. With Tenet, Christopher Nolan was attempting to break the mold of what a film could be yet again. Of course, not to the extent or same way 2001 did though. He rejected typical storytelling conventions in favor of a puzzle-like plot structure, and unsurprisingly, most audiences were not receptive to these new ideas. Cinema now has a strict definition in the public eye, and most were unwilling to go into Tenet with the unique mindset required to enjoy it. It's impossible to tell whether the world has either moved past the line of thinking that allows for new ideas to thrive, or if the world just isn't ready for these concepts yet. In other words, I believe that Tenet was either released too late, or significantly ahead of its time. And while I'm not sure what side of the timeline we fall on, I wouldn't be surprised if, years from now, we look back at Tenet as one of the greatest movies in Nolan's filmography. And this is a huge stretch, but potentially one of the greatest films of all time. Of course, I don't think Tenet is anywhere close to one of the greatest films of all time. That's not what I'm saying at all. But I am saying that because of the unique nature of Tenet, a potential shift in mindset from audiences could lead to Tenet being singled out for daring to try something new. It has the potential to leave a legacy that inspires future filmmakers and completely shift the conversation surrounding it on its head. Or none of that happens, and Tenet is forever seen as a stain on Nolan's filmography by a majority of viewers. Either way, I personally enjoyed my time with Tenet, and Tenet would go on to have an interesting effect on Nolan's career from here on out, as it would be the last time Nolan would work with Warner Bros. This is significant, as he had been partnering with the studio since Insomnia in 2002. Allegedly, Nolan parted ways with Warner Bros. Over their handling of not only Tenet's release, but also other movies they released day and date in theaters and on HBO Max, all without consulting the people involved in actually making these movies. This led to Nolan's very next project, Oppenheimer, being financed and distributed by Universal. Following the contentious release of Tenet, some felt that Nolan had a lot to prove with his next project. Did Oppenheimer live up to these high expectations? Did Nolan establish himself once again as the premier filmmaker of his generation? That's what we'll be discussing next week. If that sounds interesting to you, let me know in the comments, and subscribe for more content like this. Thanks for watching.